Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. While her older brother David excelled in sports and her younger sister Emma charmed everyone with her bubbly personality, Sarah found comfort in books and solitude. At 17, she possessed a gentle soul that most people overlooked, including her own family. The Martinez household buzzed with constant activity. David's football trophies lined the mantelpiece, and Emma's dance recital photos covered the refrigerator. Sarah's academic achievements, however, were met with casual nods and quick congratulations before the conversation shifted to more exciting topics. Her parents, Maria and Roberto, worked demanding jobs and seemed to have little energy left for their middle child's quieter accomplishments. Sarah learned to navigate life in the shadows of her siblings' brightness. She would sit at the dinner table, listening to animated discussions about David's upcoming college scholarships or Emma's latest performance, contributing only when directly asked. Her observations were sharp, her insights thoughtful, but her voice rarely rose above a whisper in the family chorus. At school, Sarah blended into the background just as easily. Teachers appreciated her consistent work, but rarely called on her in class. Classmates knew her name but couldn't recall a single memorable interaction. She ate lunch alone, reading novels that transported her to worlds where quiet heroines mattered, where their thoughts and feelings drove entire narratives. The isolation wasn't cruel or intentional. It was simply the natural result of being unremarkable in a world that celebrated the loud, the confident, and the extraordinary. Sarah understood this intellectually, but the emotional weight of invisibility pressed down on her daily. She began to wonder if she would leave any mark on the world at all, or if she would simply fade away like morning mist. Her diary became her closest confidant, filled with observations about her family's dynamics, her classmates' behaviors, and her own growing sense of displacement. She wrote about feeling like a ghost in her own life, present but unnoticed, important to no one and missed by fewer still. These words, penned in careful handwriting, would prove to be more prophetic than she could have imagined. The Martinez family's routine continued unchanged. Morning rushed past with everyone grabbing breakfast and heading to their respective destinations. Evenings brought homework, television, and brief exchanges about daily events. Weekends filled with David's games, Emma's rehearsals, and household chores. Through it all, Sarah remained a constant but unremarkable presence, her contributions to family life taken for granted like electricity or running water. One evening in late October, Sarah sat in her bedroom working on a history essay about forgotten figures who shaped major events from behind the scenes. The irony wasn't lost on her as she researched women whose contributions had been overlooked by history books. She wondered if future historians would find any trace of her existence, any evidence that Sarah Martinez had walked the earth and mattered to someone. The house grew quiet as her family settled into their evening routines. Through thin walls, she could hear David talking on the phone with friends about weekend plans, Emma practicing dance moves in her room, and her parents discussing bills and work schedules. Sarah closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the dark window, seeing a girl who seemed to be disappearing a little more each day. She had no way of knowing that within weeks, her presence would be missed more desperately than anyone could imagine. The quiet girl who felt invisible to her family was about to become the center of their universe in the most tragic way possible. But for now, Sarah simply turned off her light and went to sleep, unaware that time was running out for her to be seen, truly seen, by the people she loved most. The first Friday of November arrived with an unusual chill in the air. Sarah woke to find frost covering the windows of their suburban home, creating delicate patterns that reminded her of the lace curtains in her grandmother's old house. She dressed quietly, as always, choosing a simple sweater and jeans that wouldn't draw attention. At breakfast, the family's typical morning chaos unfolded around her. David wolfed down cereal while texting his girlfriend about their date plans. Emma practiced her lines for the school play between bites of toast. Maria rushed to pack lunches while Roberto searched for his car keys. Sarah ate her breakfast in silence, observing the familiar dance of a family in motion. "Sarah, honey, can you pick up Emma from rehearsal today?" Maria called over her shoulder while pouring coffee. "David has practice, and your father and I have that parent-teacher conference for Emma at 6. Sarah nodded, though her mother had already moved on to the next task. She made a mental note to be at the school by 5:30, knowing Emma would be upset if she had to wait. Sarah had become the family's reliable constant, the one who could always be counted on to fill in the gaps without complaint. The day at school passed like most others. Sarah attended her classes, participated when required, and spent lunch period in the library working on an English paper about symbolism in Gothic literature. She found herself drawn to stories about haunting and memory, tales where the past refused to stay buried. Her teacher, Mrs. Peterson, had praised her analysis of how ghosts in literature often represented unfinished business or unresolved guilt. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah felt an odd restlessness she couldn't explain. The November sky had grown heavy with clouds, and the early darkness seemed to press against the school windows. She found herself checking the clock repeatedly during her last period chemistry class, though she had no particular reason to be anxious about the time. At 5:15, Sarah gathered her things and walked to the parking lot where her mother's car waited. The school grounds were nearly empty, with only a few students heading to evening activities. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and approaching rain. Sarah drove the familiar route to Emma's school, her mind wandering to the weekend ahead and the paper she needed to finish. She arrived at the elementary school to find the building darker than usual. Most of the after-school programs had ended, but she could see lights in the gymnasium where Emma's rehearsal should be taking place. Sarah parked and waited, expecting to see children streaming out at any moment. The minutes ticked by in unusual silence. After 20 minutes, Sarah decided to check inside. The hallways echoed with her footsteps as she made her way toward the gymnasium. She pushed open the heavy doors to find the space empty, except for stacked chairs and a janitor mopping the far corner. Confused, she approached the man and asked about the rehearsal. "Oh, that was canceled about an hour ago," he said without looking up from his work. "Water leak in the music room. They sent all the kids home early." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Emma should have called for a ride. She should have been picked up by now. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Emma's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried her parents, but both calls went to voicemail as well. They were probably already in the parent-teacher conference. She drove home quickly, expecting to find Emma there, perhaps upset about the canceled rehearsal and forgotten pickup. But the house stood empty and dark. Sarah turned on lights and checked every room, calling Emma's name. The silence that answered made her chest tighten with worry. Sarah called Emma's best friend's mother, who confirmed that Emma had been at rehearsal, but left with everyone else when it was canceled. No one had seen her since. The worry began to transform into something deeper and more frightening. Sarah tried her parents again, this time leaving urgent messages about Emma's disappearance. As she sat in the quiet house, surrounded by the ordinary objects of their daily life, Sarah realized she was experiencing something she had never felt before. For the first time in her 17 years, her family needed her desperately. She was no longer invisible or forgotten. She was the only one who knew Emma was missing, the only one who could sound the alarm. But even as she recognized the weight of this responsibility, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in their world, something that would change everything forever. The careful balance of their family life had been disturbed, and she sensed that none of them would emerge from this crisis unchanged. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted sharply with the panic rising in her throat as she explained that her 10-year-old sister had disappeared somewhere between school and home. Within 30 minutes, their house filled with people who had never paid attention to Sarah before, but now hung on her every word. Police officers asked detailed questions about Emma's habits, friends, and possible destinations. Sarah found herself serving as the family's memory bank, providing information about Emma's schedule, her favorite hiding spots, and the route she typically took home. For years, Sarah had watched and listened while others lived their lives loudly. Now her quiet observations became crucial details in a missing person case. When her parents finally arrived home, Maria collapsed into Roberto's arms, sobbing about the parent-teacher conference they had attended while their youngest daughter vanished. David raced in from football practice, his face pale with shock. Suddenly, their house buzzed with activity as neighbors, relatives, and family friends gathered to help with the search. Search teams formed quickly, with volunteers taking different sections of the neighborhood. Sarah insisted on joining the search despite her parents' protests that she should stay home in case Emma called. She couldn't bear to sit idle while her sister remained lost in the growing darkness. The temperature had dropped significantly, and light rain began to fall. Sarah chose to search the wooded area behind their neighborhood, a place where she and Emma had played when Emma was younger. Sarah remembered Emma's fascination with a small creek that ran through the trees, and how she had always wanted to build fairy houses from twigs and leaves. If Emma had decided to walk home and gotten disoriented, she might have wandered into these familiar woods. The beam of Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness as she called Emma's name repeatedly. Her voice grew hoarse, but she continued, deeper into the woods, following half-remembered paths from childhood adventures. Other searchers' voices echoed in the distance, creating an eerie chorus of desperate calls that seemed to mock the silence of the night. Near the creek, Sarah's light caught something pink fluttering from a low branch. She recognized it immediately, as the ribbon from Emma's hair, the one she had worn to school that morning. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the creek downstream, finding more clues. Emma's backpack caught on rocks in the shallow water, one of her shoes wedged between fallen logs. The creek led to an old storm drain that connected to the neighborhood's drainage system. Sarah realized with growing horror that Emma might have tried to follow the water and gotten trapped or lost in the underground tunnels. She called for help, her voice breaking with fear and exhaustion. Within minutes, rescue teams arrived with specialized equipment. They found Emma unconscious but alive in a concrete culvert about 50 yards downstream. She had apparently slipped while trying to retrieve something from the water and hit her head on the concrete wall. The cold water and head injury had left her hypothermic and barely breathing. As paramedics worked to stabilize Emma, Sarah stood in the rain watching her sister's pale face in the ambulance's harsh fluorescent light. The ribbon she had spotted now seemed like a deliberate trail left behind, as if Emma had known someone would need to find her. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and dread, grateful that Emma was alive but shaken by how close they had come to losing her forever. At the hospital, the family maintained a vigil in the waiting room while doctors worked to treat Emma's injuries. Sarah sat apart from the others, replaying the evening's events and wondering what might have happened if she hadn't noticed the canceled rehearsal, if she hadn't known Emma's favorite places, if she hadn't been there to sound the alarm. For the first time in her life, Sarah had been essential rather than invisible. Her quiet nature and careful attention to detail had literally saved Emma's life. But as she watched her parents' anguished faces and David's unusual silence, Sarah began to understand that being noticed often came at a terrible price. The family would recover from this crisis, Emma would heal, and eventually life would return to normal. But something fundamental had changed in their dynamic. Sarah was no longer just the forgotten middle child. She had proven her worth in the most dramatic way possible, and the weight of that recognition felt heavier than her previous invisibility ever had. Emma recovered completely from her injuries, but the incident left invisible scars on the entire Martinez family. In the weeks following the accident, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how her family interacted with her. Her parents asked for her opinions more often, included her in decisions about Emma's care, and praised her quick thinking during the crisis. David, usually absorbed in his own world, began acknowledging her presence with genuine smiles and occasional conversations. At first, Sarah welcomed this newfound attention. She had spent years feeling invisible, and finally being recognized felt like stepping into sunlight after living in shadows. Her parents consulted her about Emma's emotional recovery, trusting her observations about their youngest daughter's moods and fears. Teachers at school had heard about her heroic role in finding Emma, and they began calling on her more frequently in class. But as the novelty wore off, Sarah began to feel trapped by her new identity as the family's responsible one. Every small decision about Emma required her input. Her parents expected her to monitor Emma's activities with an intensity that felt overwhelming. David started asking her advice about problems he had previously handled alone. The attention she had craved for years now felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. The pressure intensified when Emma began experiencing nightmares and anxiety attacks related to her accident. Child psychologists recommended family therapy, but Emma responded best to Sarah's presence during difficult moments. Sarah found herself becoming Emma's primary emotional support, a role that required her to be constantly available and emotionally stable. Sarah's grades began to slip as she spent more time managing family dynamics than focusing on her own needs. College application deadlines approached, But she couldn't concentrate on essays and interviews when Emma needed help with homework or comfort after bad dreams. Her parents, grateful for Sarah's dedication to Emma's recovery, didn't notice that their middle daughter was drowning under the weight of their expectations. The breaking point came on a cold December evening when Sarah was supposed to attend a college interview at a nearby university. She had prepared for weeks, researching the school's programs and practicing answers to common questions. This interview represented her chance to escape into a future where she could define herself independently of her family's needs. As Sarah prepared to leave for the interview, Emma had a severe anxiety attack triggered by a thunderstorm that reminded her of the night she got lost. She clung to Sarah, sobbing and begging her not to leave the house. Maria and Roberto tried to comfort Emma, but she only calmed down when Sarah held her hand and promised to stay. Sarah looked at the clock and realized she had 15 minutes to get to an interview that was 30 minutes away. Her parents encouraged her to go, insisting they could handle Emma's attack, but Sarah saw the doubt in their eyes. Emma's grip on her hand tightened, and Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. She called the admissions office and rescheduled the interview, explaining that a family emergency had arisen. The administrator was understanding, but mentioned that the next available slot wouldn't be until late January, which might affect her application timeline. Sarah hung up the phone and spent the evening comforting Emma, watching her own future slip away one canceled commitment at a time. This pattern repeated itself throughout the winter. Sarah missed college visits, postponed standardized test retakes, and turned down social invitations to remain available for Emma's needs. Her parents expressed gratitude for her sacrifice but never suggested alternative solutions. They had become dependent on Sarah's stability in ways that felt increasingly suffocating. Sarah began to understand that saving Emma had created a new kind of invisibility. Instead of being overlooked, she was now seen only through the lens of her usefulness to others. Her individual dreams and aspirations had become secondary to her role as the family's emotional caretaker. She was visible now, but only as a reflection of everyone else's needs. Late at night, when the house finally grew quiet, Sarah would sit in her room and write in her diary about feeling more trapped than ever before. She had traded her invisibility for responsibility, her freedom for recognition. The quiet girl who had once felt like a ghost in her own life now felt like she was disappearing in an entirely different way, consumed by the needs of people who loved her but couldn't see past their dependence on her strength. The weight of being essential was proving far heavier than the pain of being forgotten had ever been. By February, Sarah had reached a breaking point that none of her family members recognized. The college application process had become a series of missed deadlines and rescheduled appointments. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Chen, called several meetings to discuss Sarah's declining academic performance and apparent loss of direction regarding her future plans. During one particularly difficult session, Mrs. Chen asked Sarah directly about her goals and dreams. Sarah found herself unable to articulate any personal ambitions beyond managing her family's emotional needs. The realization terrified her. She had spent so many years feeling invisible that she had never developed a strong sense of her own identity, and now that identity was being completely absorbed by her role as the family caretaker, Sarah began experiencing physical symptoms of stress, headaches, insomnia, and a persistent feeling of anxiety that made it difficult to concentrate on anything beyond Emma's immediate needs. She lost weight and developed dark circles under her eyes, but her family attributed these changes to the natural stress of senior year, rather than recognizing them as signs of her emotional breakdown. The final catalyst came during Emma's birthday party in late February. The entire extended family gathered to celebrate Emma's recovery and her 11th birthday. Relatives praised Sarah repeatedly for saving Emma's life, referring to her as the family hero and Emma's guardian angel. Emma, now fully recovered and thriving, basked in the attention while Sarah served cake and cleaned up spills. During the party, Sarah overheard a conversation between her aunt and mother about Sarah's future. Her aunt asked about Sarah's college plans, and Maria responded with a casual shrug, saying that Sarah would probably attend the local community college so she could continue helping with Emma's care. The conversation revealed that her parents had never seriously considered that Sarah might want to leave home or pursue her own dreams. That night, After everyone had gone home and the house was clean, Sarah sat in her room staring at the acceptance letter she had received from a university 3 states away. She had applied before Emma's accident, back when she still believed her future could be her own. The letter offered her a partial scholarship and the chance to study literature in a program known for nurturing quiet, thoughtful students who found their voices through writing. Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She began secretly planning her escape from the suffocating web of family expectations. She contacted the university to confirm her enrollment, arranged for student loans to cover the remaining costs, and quietly prepared to leave home after graduation. She told no one about her plans, knowing that any discussion would result in guilt, manipulation, and ultimately, the abandonment of her dreams. The months leading up to graduation were the most difficult of Sarah's life. She continued to care for Emma while secretly counting down the days until she could reclaim her own existence. The guilt was overwhelming, but she reminded herself that Emma was healthy and that the family had managed perfectly well before. Sarah became their emotional anchor. Sarah's behavior began to change in subtle ways that her family didn't recognize as warning signs. She became more distant, responding to requests for help with mechanical compliance rather than genuine warmth. She stopped initiating conversations and began spending more time alone in her room. Her family interpreted these changes as typical senior year stress rather than signs of her growing detachment. During her graduation ceremony, Sarah sat among her classmates feeling like she was already a ghost. Her family cheered enthusiastically when her name was called, but Sarah felt disconnected from their celebration. She was no longer the invisible middle child or the essential family caretaker. She was becoming something else entirely, a person preparing to disappear completely from their lives. The summer before her planned departure was a carefully orchestrated performance. Sarah pretended to research local colleges while secretly preparing for her real future. She worked a part-time job to save money for her escape, telling her parents the money was for college expenses without specifying which college she meant. She maintained her role as Emma's primary support while emotionally withdrawing from the family bonds that had once defined her existence. As August approached and her secret departure date drew near, Sarah began to feel a strange sense of power. For the first time in her life, she was in complete control of her own destiny. Her family had no idea that the quiet, reliable daughter they had come to depend on was about to vanish from their lives as suddenly and completely as Emma had disappeared into those woods 9 months earlier. The difference was that Sarah's disappearance would be permanent, and unlike Emma's accident, it would be entirely intentional. Sarah left on a Tuesday morning in mid-August while her family slept. She had packed only essential items, leaving behind photo albums, childhood mementos, and anything that might create sentimental attachment to her old life. Her note was brief and matter-of-fact, explaining that she had enrolled in a university across the country and would not be returning home. She provided no forwarding address and asked them not to contact her. The Martinez family discovered her absence and the note during breakfast. Maria's screams brought the neighbors running, and Roberto immediately called the police, insisting that Sarah had been kidnapped or was having a mental breakdown. David searched her room frantically for clues about her whereabouts while Emma sat in confused silence, unable to understand why her protective older sister had abandoned her without explanation. The police investigation revealed the truth. Sarah was legally an adult who had left voluntarily with her own money and possessions. She had covered her tracks carefully, using cash for travel and providing false information about her destination. The family learned about her real college acceptance through the guidance counselor, but the school refused to provide Sarah's contact information due to privacy regulations. For the first few weeks, the Martinez family functioned in a state of shocked disbelief. They called Sarah's cell phone repeatedly until the number was disconnected. They hired a private investigator who confirmed that Sarah had enrolled in the university, but had specifically requested that no information about her be shared with family members. She had effectively erased herself from their lives with surgical precision. Emma's reaction was the most devastating. She blamed herself for Sarah's disappearance, convinced that her neediness had driven her sister away. She began experiencing symptoms similar to those she had after her accident: nightmares, anxiety attacks, and an inability to concentrate at school. The family therapist explained that Emma was experiencing a different kind of trauma, the abandonment by someone she had considered her primary protector. Maria and Roberto struggled to understand how they had failed to see Sarah's unhappiness. They reviewed their interactions with her, searching for signs they had missed or warning signals they had ignored. They realized with growing horror that they had known very little about Sarah's inner life, her dreams, or her feelings about her role in the family. She had been simultaneously essential and invisible to them. David surprised everyone by becoming Emma's primary emotional support during Sarah's absence. He had never paid much attention to family dynamics before, but Sarah's departure forced him to step into a caretaking role he was unprepared for, but gradually learned to navigate. His relationship with Emma deepened as he tried to fill the void Sarah had left behind. The family's daily routines collapsed without Sarah's organizing presence. Maria realized how much she had depended on Sarah to manage household schedules, remember important details, and serve as a bridge between family members. Simple tasks like coordinating Emma's activities or managing doctor's appointments became complicated without Sarah's quiet competence. As months passed, the family's shock transformed into a complex mixture of anger, guilt, and longing. They began to understand that Sarah's departure was not impulsive, but carefully planned over many months. This realization forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about how they had treated her and what they had expected from her without ever asking if she wanted to provide it. The house felt haunted by Sarah's absence in ways that went beyond simple missing. Her empty bedroom became a shrine to their collective guilt. Her former responsibilities created daily reminders of how much they had relied on her invisible labor. Family gatherings felt incomplete. Conversations had gaps that Sarah's observations had once filled, and decisions that had once been easy became sources of conflict without Sarah's diplomatic presence. Emma began having conversations with Sarah's empty room, telling her about school events and asking for advice about problems she didn't know how to solve alone. These one-sided conversations disturbed her parents, who worried that Emma was developing an unhealthy attachment to an absent sister who might never return. The family slowly began to function without Sarah, but they never stopped feeling the weight of her absence. They had created a ghost through their neglect and dependence, and that ghost now haunted their daily lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. Sarah had achieved a kind of presence in absence that was more powerful than her physical presence had ever been. By Christmas, they realized that Sarah was not coming back, and their family would never be the same. The quiet girl they had overlooked for 17 years had found the most dramatic way possible to make them notice her, by disappearing completely and leaving them to face the consequences of their blindness to her needs and dreams. 2 years after Sarah's disappearance, the Martinez family had learned to live with the ghost they had created through their neglect and dependence. Emma, now 13, had grown stronger and more independent, though she still kept Sarah's photograph on her nightstand and wrote letters she never sent. David had graduated and begun college himself, carrying the weight of understanding how easily a family member could become invisible until they chose to vanish entirely. The family had undergone extensive therapy, both individually and together, learning to communicate in ways they never had when Sarah lived among them. They spoke her name regularly now, acknowledging her presence in their memories, and their ongoing guilt about how they had failed to see her as an individual with her own needs and dreams. Maria had quit her demanding job to focus on being more present for her remaining children, a decision that came too late to benefit Sarah, but helped her recognize patterns of neglect she was determined not to repeat. Roberto had learned to express emotions he had previously buried, talking openly about his regret over never having a real conversation with his middle daughter about her hopes for the future. The ghost of Sarah's absence had taught them painful lessons about taking people for granted, about the difference between being physically present and truly seen. They had memorialized her not through photos and mementos, but through changed behaviors and heightened awareness of each other's emotional needs. On a cold February evening, exactly 3 years after Sarah's disappearance, the doorbell rang during dinner. Emma answered the door to find a young woman with familiar eyes and a confident bearing that seemed foreign, yet recognizable. Sarah had returned, but she was no longer the invisible girl who had left their house in the darkness of an August morning. She was taller, her posture straighter, her voice stronger. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had discovered her own worth outside of her family's expectations. Her hair was shorter, her clothing more stylish, and her demeanor suggested someone who had learned to take up space in the world rather than shrink from it. The family's reunion was awkward and emotionally charged. Sarah accepted their tears and apologies with polite distance, explaining that she had come to establish boundaries for a relationship that could never return to its previous dynamics. She had graduated with honors, majored in literature, and planned to pursue graduate studies in writing. She had built a life that belonged entirely to her. Sarah listened to their explanations about therapy, changed family dynamics, and lessons learned from her absence. She acknowledged their growth while making it clear that her forgiveness did not mean a return to her previous role. As the family's emotional manager, she had learned to value her own needs and would not sacrifice her independence to manage their guilt or grief. The conversation revealed that Sarah's disappearance had been a form of self-preservation rather than revenge, though its effects on the family had served as an unintended punishment for years of benign neglect. She had not intended to create a haunting presence in their lives, but her absence had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their family dynamics. Sarah agreed to maintain contact with specific boundaries, regular phone calls, occasional visits, and inclusion in major family events, but no return to her role as the family's primary emotional caretaker. She had learned to be visible in her own life and would not become invisible again for anyone's comfort. Not even her family's Emma, now older and more mature, understood that Sarah's return did not mean everything would go back to the way it was before. She had learned to rely on herself and her parents in ways that made her stronger, though she still treasured the memory of Sarah's protection during her darkest moments. Their relationship would be different now, built on choice rather than obligation. The family had spent 3 years learning to live with the ghosts they had created through their neglect. Now they would learn to live with the real Sarah, who had returned not as the invisible girl they remembered, but as a woman who refused to be forgotten or taken for granted ever again. The ghost had served its purpose, teaching them to see and value what they had lost. Now they would discover whether they could love and respect the person Sarah had chosen to become. In the end, Sarah's disappearance had been both an act of self-preservation and an unintentional haunting that forced her family to confront their failures. She had returned not to resume her old role, but to establish a new relationship based on mutual respect and recognition. The forgotten girl had found her voice and her power, and she would never be invisible again.